Welcome, BDE. Do we
And
get?
then there were two.
Then there were two. I was like, do we get paid by the hour? So these guys aren't like coasting on us for our multitudes of riches over here at BDE.
Well, I was fully expecting Kirk, but I'm intrigued by his extended absence. I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, I don't know if we're allowed to disclose
Probably not
what he's doing, but
anyway,
yeah, it's pretty baller.
So
I'll give Kirk that.
Look for some, hopefully, very intriguing content.
Yeah,
when he gets back in the chair.
Hopefully he is shooting that, and then
of course he may have moved on.
Yeah, Colin's out actually running a company that has a knowledge share app called Collide that is growing users and user experience like 20 to 30%.
What are you saying about
month.
us?
We're
not.
Yeah, we're not doing shit. We're sitting here and watching and listening to our time. All right. In a world that I know nothing about, but it's something we got to talk about, so hopefully you'll carry the ball on this one. Woodside buys Tellurian for $900 million.
All cash, 75% premium to, I didn't look at the timeline of I assume that's last trade.
Because it was a buck a share, right? And like
well, they're paying a buck a share.
Yeah, but that's like the lowest number you can put into the calculator, right? So I'm not sure it was a 75% premium as opposed to
maybe your calculator.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, and the Astros are back in first place, so that's
John Granado is going nuts because he called it 45 days ago on the radio.
It only took him 24 to come from 10 games back, which is the fastest in Major League history for that.
So
deficit.
Real quick, and we'll go back to LNG, but so the greatest Houston athlete, I think, is Akeem Olajuwon. I think we can kind of we can all, because you throw in championships and all that. At the end of his career, are we saying it's Altuve?
Boy, that's a tough one.
I think he's in range of taking Olajuwon out. Now, Olajuwon is a top 10, top 15 player of all time. I don't think you say the same thing about Altuve, but in terms of meaningful impact when it counts.
Yeah. As absurd as it sounds, Olajuwon was undersized for the era of NBA centers.
Yeah.
How they played and what their role was. All-time leader in blocks per game, which is stunning.
Yeah.
And I was completely compelled by his athleticism that he brought to the role of centers, having grown up, in the 80s with the true classic center. And so if we think about the comparative of undersized athletes and overachieving, then I would say it's a virtual tie. Yeah. Now, the ability to lead the team on an extended string of success is a lot harder on an individual player when there's 9 players on the field.
And you have to bat in order.
Right.
Et cetera.
And you're doing successfully, at least 30% of the time, the hardest thing to do in sports.
Right.
Which is hit a high velocity baseball that is moving. Not moving in terms of velocity. It's actually moving around.
Yeah. Although, I guess if it's ever a tie, you have to watch what Olajuwon did to David Robinson in that series when he didn't win the MVP. So, all right. Anyway, let's go back. So Woodside, the Australians, I've been to Australia. The biggest E&P company in Australia buys Tellurian.
Yeah, $900 million, all cash. Tellurian's essentially, as I think about it, a single asset company, which is the Driftwood LNG project, projected to be at 27.6 MTPA by 2028. Where is the project? It's essentially got the groundwork, literally the physical construction of the groundwork,
bought the land, poured some concrete.
Exactly. And so, at least as far as I could tell from their March investor update, that the expectation was that actual construction, Bechtel being the primary GC, EPC provider, would start sometime in the second half of 2024. And so as far as Woodside's motivations, yes, you have an in-motion project that is fundamentally permitted, and that permit is related to the non-free trade agreement country permit with Aethon, which is the upstream provider that that Tellurian is selling to pay down some debt. But future agreements essentially are going to require re-permitting. FTA agreements are going to require re-permitting, which then puts the risk of being exposed to the Biden pause back in play. But you do have more than just dirt here. You do have a contract in hand, a non-FTA contract, and let's face it, Woodside's been pretty successful in your favorite new country in terms of the history and the legacy of LNG in Australia.
Yeah. So,
and I don't know if there were, I don't follow Tellurian that closely. But I don't know if there were things that were creating some more headwinds with respect to being able to continue to obtain the financing to actually execute the project going forward.
Well, it never helps when you kick out the founder,
right?
When it comes to raising more money.
Yeah, and so it's a good. We can think of a close to $1 billion bolt-on portfolio for, and probably the best exit for Martin Houston and Tellurian.
Yeah.
At this point in time, just given all the crosswinds of uncertainty related to cost, we saw the Zachary bankruptcy or the Zachary entity bankruptcy on the Exxon project, and so quite a bit of roiling markets in LNG and how we think about future capacity build out. So,
and I haven't heard
a bit of a risk option for Woodside.
Well, and I haven't heard any scuttlebutt from any of the banking stuff, where there are 5 bidders and, this one eked it out. Were they the only bidders? So potentially that stuff will come out. I think at the end of the day, is it the right price? We'll know in 5 years. Woodside either massively overpaid for something that's wallowing in the mud, or wow, they're shooting LNG all over the place.
Yeah,
and it was a shrewd move. So, all right, Financial Times wrote a article on one of your favorite things, critical minerals mining.
Yeah, there was a piece out. I think it was July the 18th, just talking about, can we make it happen? And the thing that was compelling was a ranking of the key critical minerals producing countries, where the U.S. ranked next to last in terms of cycle time of new mine discovery to commissioning production from a new mine of 29 years, where the global average is 23. And there were no countries, and we'll find that stacked bar of the country's cycle times. There were no countries, the fastest were still over a decade. And so what are the implications of that? We've talked a lot about the IRA. We have some ramping, both U.S. content rules under the IRA to qualify for things like batteries and renewables machines that really start to ramp in 2025. I'm not going to go into the details of what those content prescriptions are, but if you look at U.S. copper, for example, we consume in the U.S. 1.8 million metric tons per year, and we produce 48% of that domestically. I don't know what the split is between actual kind of mine source and processed copper, but
which is actually, when we were talking about this morning, that was kind of shocking.
Seems higher than you think.
Higher than I would think.
Yeah. And so squaring all that with the ramping content prescriptions in the IRA, you start to think about just the North Star of 2050 and some of the nearer term emissions reductions goals and the incentivizing aspects of the IRA, how does that line up? Well, if I take, for rounder math, 2025 and add 29 years to it, it puts me out beyond 2050.
Yeah.
We'll cover more. I've got a piece in the works that I hope to launch as the first blog on a kind of working title, BDE Sidetrack, where we take things and write more extensively.
This is news breaking right here, right?
I don't know about that, but
that feels very news breaking. Am I too big a prick if I say by Friday?
Oh, not at all.
Not at all. I'm not too big a prick for saying it. I love it.
And so this, I think, is a good segue into, and who'd have thought after last week's shows.
Well, let me say one more thing about the mining, because you and I were talking about it this morning. And I just had a thought, if we're going to not mine here, not in my backyard, but we need all these minerals to be able to do the energy transition that we all seem to want to do. The way we achieve that is unfortunately going to be a crisis. That's the way we have a tendency to govern in the United States. It's going to be a crisis, and it's probably going to lead to nefarious foreign policy stuff we do. I will go overthrow a government somewhere so that we can get a hold of minerals. We'll have a confrontation with China over something that we shouldn't have and all. And, we're going to roll into talking about Biden, and I'll let you do it. But I was just thinking that, that every time we don't have thoughtful policy about stuff, it leads us to actions that are usually bad that people get hurt over. Does that make sense?
It does.
And
I think more practically what we're going to see, just given these, the seemingly growing wall of inertia and all of this, is we'll have attempts at legislative modification of things like the IRA, which then relax some of the prescriptions related to things like content. But we have administrative agency rulings that run theoretically counter to the legislative and executive objectives. And I mentioned one as a few weeks ago. You've got a copper and zinc prospective mine in Northwest Alaska, but that was essentially stopped cold because the Interior Department said, we're going to take no action on the permits for rights of way for the Ambler Road. So the Ambler mine in Alaska. Well, if I can't have rights of way through protected part of the route through, forget what the name of I think it's the Gates of the Arctic Preserve, then you can't do it. And I think a more fundamental point is that all of this stuff starts with digging something out of the ground. But if you can't dig it, you can't do it.
Right.
Because they are the primary building blocks of everything that we're trying to do with more sustainability in the energy machines and energy production. So I was going to let you give us the prelude to, who would have thought that after an attempted presidential assassination last weekend, where we touched on 2 consecutive shows last weeks, that we would have even more sensational political.
Yeah, because we're not
drive the discussion.
We're not politics per se, but just the dominance of it is making us have to talk about it. And I think we've actually done a pretty good job of avoiding politics through the history of the show. So let's do this. It's happened 6 times in history where a president has chosen not to run for reelection. James K. Polk, who is very underappreciated as a president. He added a lot of land. If you go look, a lot of the land we have was Polk. He was the expansionist president. James Buchanan, Rutherford B. Hayes, and those are all in the, that's all, call it 1845 to 1881. So those three choose not to run again. Calvin Coolidge in 1929 chooses not to run again. And
what was his nickname?
I don't know.
Silent.
Yeah. The joke was, lady walks up and says, I bet somebody I could get you to say 3 words. And he said, you lose, and walked off. Supposedly a true story. Coolidge, maybe fortunately for Coolidge, decides not to run again in 1929. Harry Truman decided not to run again. I guess technically, under the current rules, he couldn't run today again. But back then, we didn't have the amendment in place that limited you to 2
FDR
terms. Because he took over FDR
3 months after his 4th term started.
Yeah. So I forget what it is on I think it's if you make it more than 2 years of a term, that counts as a term. So you can't, but anyway. And then Lyndon Johnson. And Lyndon Johnson withdrew from the race in 1968, just in the face of Vietnam, strife, all that sort of stuff. And that's probably your best analogy in terms of what's going on today.
Yeah, I saw an interview with RFK Jr. last night, and he was talking about the similarities between 1968 and what's happened here in recent days. And the country was deeply divided in 1968 over Vietnam. His father, well, back to Johnson. Johnson had narrowly won the New Hampshire primary in March of 1968 and was facing the Wisconsin primary on April 2nd. So his televised address of, I'm not going to run and I'm not going to accept the nomination, was in advance of that, where I think some projections were he could have finished in Wisconsin as poorly as 3rd, which for a sitting president in its own party primaries would have been disastrous. So coming out of that, you actually had Hubert Humphrey leading in terms of delegate counts, followed pretty closely. I don't remember what the respective totals were, followed pretty closely by RFK Jr. RFK Jr. is assassinated in June. And then you go, ironically, to the DNC in Chicago, which is where the DNC this year is, and you have that open kind of nominating free-for-all. The issues then, seemingly more acute. I can't imagine social media then dealing with things like the Vietnam War and the divided country over that whole policy dimension. But I just thought it was a very insightful comparison by someone who obviously is very directly exposed to that and been touched by it a couple of times. So anyway.
So let's throw some history on here. And this is only because I looked it up. Therefore, I'm gonna say it. But what's wild is the first convention nominating someone for president was by the Anti-Masonic Party in 1831. And the Democrats and the Whigs shortly thereafter adopted it. So
was that during Andrew Jackson's time?
I guess that is. Wasn't Jackson 32?
I think so.
Yeah. So anyway, so before that, the party leaders just voted in secrecy and they nominated a president, and democracy was in effect the general election, this guy running against that guy. And basically conventions were the way you nominated a president until the 60s, really. There was one experiment in between 1912. The Republicans actually had 9 state primaries. It was a novel concept back then. Let's go let people vote, see who they wanted. What happened was Teddy Roosevelt stepped in, and he was winning each one of those primaries by ridiculous margins. I think he won Pennsylvania 90%, 75% in Illinois, something like that. But Taft, who didn't win a primary, wound up getting the Republican nomination that year. And so that's the Bull Moose party split that we've read about. So you get to 1968, and what happened to the convention is what you were talking about just a second ago. Humphrey never even participated in a primary, and he walks away with the nomination in kind of a backroom brokered
that was the alternative was the Democratic caucuses.
Yeah. And so anyway, he gets it. All hell breaks loose. So the Democrats actually commissioned the McGovern-Fraser Commission in 1969. I think McGovern was a senator, and he was head of the DNC at the time, 28 people. They came up with rules, regulations, procedures, and all this. But the punchline was they put in place stuff so that the nomination process would favor the primary results and reduce the power of party leaders. And they trumped it, pun intended, trumped it as more democratic. This is supporting democracy. And
the machines don't like that.
And the machines do not like that. But the reason I kind of bring that up is, and we talked about this last week when we talked politics, it was always like, well, what does this mean for energy? And I think what we said last week was, look at what our government is willing to lie to us about and do to cover things up. They've got to be doing that to energy as well. And I think we're going to talk more this week on steroids of that. I mean, basically the Democrats who have been telling us we've got to save democracy are literally reversing stuff they put in place to be more democratic. I mean, this is, we talk about going back to the olden times, which were bad in various scenarios, and they're doing it.
Well,
and it's only because they're losing. I mean, they are not sitting there saying, Joe, you shouldn't run because this is a national security crisis, you dealing with Putin. They're saying, hey, dude, you got caught. Everybody's going to see it. We're going to lose it. We're going to lose the House and the Senate too. So they're doing this. So I'll shut up. And again, I'm not trying to be Republicans versus Democrats. I'm sure.
What are you?
Yeah, I'm a libertarian. I'm sure the Trump administration will lie on stuff. The thing you have going with when Trump administration lies, you at least have a bulldog media going after them on every turn. So you're highlighting it. But anyway, I'll shut up.
I think there's, and perhaps this is a bit of naivete, but I don't think so. I think a lot of the pronouncements, there are clearly political objectives in policy positions and bold pronouncements on things like energy. And let's talk about energy. I do think that in the spirit of not attributing to malice what can be otherwise attributed to incompetence.
Fair enough.
At least from the rhetoric and the substance or lack of substance in a lot of the policy pronouncements, particularly by those that are out on the front lines of political campaigns and leading candidates, is that there's for those of us who have some beyond layperson level of expertise in energy, I think about the end of last week's convention. I saw an analysis on Twitter where I think it was stated that in the review of the transcript that Trump mentioned energy, I want to say 1,000 times in 90 minutes. That seems like a lot, but it was a lot. And then you saw the kind of the rallying cry of drill, baby, drill. Whereas before it's been very, very lightly touched upon, if not at all. And so we were talking about it before the show started, this notion of, okay, we're going to bring down energy prices immediately via drill, baby, drill, doesn't really square with what the industry, at least the U.S. industry, has been about for the last 5 years, certainly since COVID, capital discipline. These are private companies acting not only in their national interest, but in the interest of their shareholders, where returns and cash flow have been paramount. And there's also the looming specter of other forces in the global commodities markets, not the least of which is the fact that OPEC Plus has got discretionary 2.5+ million barrels a day off the market that is theoretically available to
at their whim.
Yeah,
I mean, right.
So that's a weapon, and it really comes down to, I think, a lot of these pronouncements, and particularly in soundbited political and policy statements, are just woefully uninformed about how the global energy markets work. And so that's stating the obvious to those who are in our orbit in energy. But I just think that, we've moved so far beyond holding any politician or any government accountable for statements made, certainly in the heat of a political campaign, when those results that they promised do not transpire. There's always a workaround or a deflection.
Yeah.
Now, you were talking earlier about kind of the tilt of the media and the messaging around that. I do think the way that President Trump has been challenged on everything that he said by the media is much more of a kind of truth arbiter than what the other side has been subjected to. And that's, we'll see. I think the more interesting dynamic that comes out of what's happened over the last few weeks, and certainly this past weekend, is what does it mean for the divide on energy policy? Oil and gas dominant, drill baby drill, versus those things that are embedded in the IRA, and even more extreme, where the vice president has been attached to explicit campaigns to end fossil fuels, fracking bans, et cetera. Is the specter of a widening divide really the best thing right now, given kind of where we are?
Yeah, no, she's not been constructive on energy and energy policy, and so and look, I don't necessarily think the Trump administration was necessarily constructive on education and policy. There was more kind of a free rein, but at the end of the day, it was get gasoline prices down because I want to get reelected, period. So it will be interesting to see if somehow in any of this, some substance could happen on energy policy where the public could be somewhat informed, although my sense is there's going to be shrilling at each other on both sides with this campaign. So
yeah, I think it's going to get more about kind of personal attacks on both sides.
Yeah.
And will be,
well, it already has been. Yeah.
It'll be zero sum in terms of trying to score points if things stay as they are. There was, I forget who was talking about it last night, said really what the power brokers in the Democratic Party are telling you, not explicitly, but they're telling you, is they realize that there's got to be a moderation in where their leading candidate is in this particular election on the left-right spectrum. And so if we can take Vice President Harris's orientation at face value, it is more extreme vis-a-vis oil and gas and the fossil fuel future in general. And so I think that's an interesting conundrum in the middle of how the Democrats are thinking about positioning a candidate. But there's a whole host of other issues that impact upon the ultimate decision. And so I think you've seen the Clintons, Whitmer, and a couple of others come out and endorse Biden's tweet that followed his official announcement. That endorsement was not in that letter to the American people.
Right.
But a few minutes later, he tweeted out
the 23-year-old that runs his account tweeted out.
Right. So,
it will be no matter. So some interesting energy dynamics that could play out. There's talk that Joe Manchin is going to throw his hat in the ring to run for president. Because I guess at this point, barring change in party rules, the delegates are going to vote. And I think they have to vote. They vote before the convention because to get on the ballot in one state, you have to be declared your state's, your party's candidate. So there's going to be a vote that's upcoming before before the convention. The delegates are going to vote. And what's interesting is the delegates are Biden people, right? They worked for Biden. Generally speaking, they're more kind of moderate party regulars as opposed to the extremes. And so could a Joe Manchin re-register as a Democrat and make hay? That would be a really interesting development for the energy business, because I think the energy business would potentially be okay with him as a president.
He actually said, I think this morning, that he's not. He's not going to be a candidate.
He's not going to. Okay. And then I think the really interesting dynamic is no matter who wins, who do we get as a Secretary of Energy? And I'm going to give you a reason why some really good candidate would do it. When you sell all your stock and you join the cabinet, it's capital gains free. So, I mean, if there's somebody with a big, huge built-in gain, $1.5 billion, $2 billion worth of stock, that's in effect, call it 25%. To go take a cabinet position, even if it's for like.
Well, wasn't that kind of the dust up over Tellurian being named Secretary of State?
Yeah,
under the Trump administration.
Yeah, he got to say.
Yeah,
or I don't know that he actually sold his Exxon stock or not, but there was definitely discussion of it. So anyway, that's the reason you'd get a good one. I will say, literally the demonization and the mess of this campaign, as well as arguably the last two, if there was a chance for a decent person to want to go to Washington, I can't imagine anybody would want to go there. So,
well, he was ambassador, and I always met Tellurian, who served 8 presidents as in the State Department, I think dating back maybe to Ford or even Nixon. In fact, he was one time the U.S. ambassador to Syria. So he said in advance of the 2016 campaign, in a bit of a quip, in thinking about, what both parties had brought forth relative to his much longer perspective in history with past presidential campaigns, basically said, we kind of face a poverty of choice here. and so whether you agree or disagree with that characterization as being maybe a bit too harsh, if you look at what, the campaigns themselves take on a life of their own lately, and that's just the nature of politics. And I was thinking about it as I was writing some other things this weekend in my own political participation history. I was really into it when I was first old enough to vote. I got to vote in one of the Reagan elections, actually volunteered on some stuff. But really ever since then, I've gotten just a bit more disillusioned, and a lot more in the last decade plus, it used to be really interesting to me because there seemed to be more substantive focus on policy
Right.
and not personality.
Yeah.
And this almost reality show aura that every political campaign seems to take on. I don't care if it's at the state or local level. Think, the things that go on when, for example, Texas Senate seat comes up between Cruz and Beto
Right.
not too long ago. It just evolves into this very unsavory kind of personal attack, point scoring, gotcha game that, it's a shame that it's kind of devolved to this, because we do have extremely important policy decisions and strategies to get right, and energy's at the very top of the list.
Yeah. I mean, it's arguably top 3 in terms of national security concerns. I mean, you obviously have nuclear bombs, et cetera. What my suggested rule for political campaigns is that each candidate and their families once every 2 weeks have to go eat dinner for an hour and a half, no cameras, secluded location, no cell phones in there, no one else. Candidate A, his or her family, candidate B, his or her family, they all got to go eat dinner together. Because, I mean, it is just crazy.
Hosted by Sally Yates.
Oh, yeah, Sally could cook. Yeah, that would
more than that, Sally could be the greatest referee.
Oh, yeah, Sally's great at refereeing. She'd have everybody eating baba ganoush or whatever, or chicken fried steak. She's got a wide range. So last thing, just because this, I mean, I guess we actually didn't report the news, but everybody knows that Biden has decided to not run for reelection.
And where did it show up first?
Showed up on X in a letter. What's really crazy is we haven't seen Biden in 5 days. This is crazy. I mean, I get putting out a letter. I would have thought he would have addressed my fellow Americans. I've decided, and at least give a reason. Here's, I don't feel good because of this COVID or whatever. I'm not running. And you would have thought he did that. Johnson did that. He was on the air for 45 minutes when he puts out a letter. Usually when you, in effect, put out a press release, you also put out at least a still photograph of you walking in or something. I mean, I don't think we've seen proof, and I'm not saying he's dead. I'm not that big a tinfoil hat, but it is kind of weird we haven't heard from the president. Now, I guess I get that he's really pissed, because people stabbed him in the back. But at some point, this becomes a national security issue. If our enemies know that our president is debilitated or something, anyway.
Yeah. And I saw one criticism after, I guess, Trump had put something out on Truth Social that was then shared on Twitter about how quickly he took the advantage of being able to say something pretty, look, I told you so.
Yeah.
I did see where upon Vance being named vice presidential contender on the ticket, Vice President Harris was out close to a nanosecond with a pretty kind of harsh characterization of J.D. Vance as being, he's never been about the country, he's in it for himself, to which he fired back, look, I served in the U.S. Marines and built a company. What have you done?
Yeah.
That's the kind of skirmishing I think we can expect going forward that, is really unhelpful to really highlighting what the policy differences are. It's all going to be about this war of personality and gotcha comments that'll be soundbited into characterizations of things that are completely inaccurate about either side.
Yeah.
One of the things, getting back to energy, that I thought was interesting, we talk about this I think there's if things stay status quo and proceed the way they're going, the divide on energy policy gets wider. I just don't think there's going to be a concession made by either side about, we're in essence on either side picking winners in the long-term energy future. One is 100% renewables. One is continued dominance by oil and gas. I listened to a podcast this weekend. Arjun Murthy, who we've mentioned many times, was on Dave Greeley's podcast. I think it's called Smarter Markets. My apologies if I didn't get that right. But Arjun brought up the point about India. And India is certainly climbing the GDP attainment ladder, as I like to think about it. So if India went from its current 2 barrels per capita consumption per year to halfway to the US, which is 20, so 10, India becomes essentially a net importer of crude oil and products of 45 million barrels a day per year, or 45 million barrels a day. No way they want to do that. No way I think they can do that. The point is that the U.S., through policy and strategy on the energy front, has a fundamental opportunity to lead through really capitalism and free markets, the development of viable technologies at scale. And so this notion of the foundation of the global energy industry still resides in the U.S., and certainly all of the relevant technologies I think we can expect are going to come out of U.S. industry innovation, both from the industry and in conjunction with new technology partners.
Yeah.
The question is pace and timeline. So if you're in advance of the race being decided, picking winners that for whatever reason have all kinds of practical limitations, technical limitations, you're only going to protract the timeline and raise the risk where we're going to lurch from mini crisis to mini crisis, either in the U.S. or globally, more importantly, where we've got a huge disproportionate amount of the population between now and certainly 2050 that is going to be wanting to get more prosperous. That's just fundamental.
Yeah.
And so the way I look at what I believe is going to be a bigger divide or a widening divide in this potential presidential election on energy policy is a bit sobering, if not a little bit sad, just because I think we're getting past, the last few years of difficulty brought on by COVID and other things, and the reality that the market is telling you on certain things like EVs and kind of slowing the roll for a lot of reasons, getting back to a more kind of pragmatic and practical evaluation of all things, not just oil and gas, not just renewables. And this is potentially a bit of a setback to that, whatever that momentum is that's been building here for the last year or two.
Yeah. I mean, I've said it a million times, so I'll beat the dead horses. We just can't tell the next billion people on the planet that are in Africa and Southeast Asia, hey guys, you eat cake. I mean, they've got to be able to have energy so that they can live the kind of life that they want to live. And quite frankly, any human deserves to live. And I like your point. I mean, so if I'm summarizing our take on this, my take is, holy cow, there was potentially a coup on all this. Just look how evil the government is. So I did my libertarian bashing there, but related it back to energy, saying they'll do that to a president, they'll do that to the energy narrative. We talked potentially that how do we get thoughtful people to come together on a campaign or serve as a Secretary of Energy. Yuck, probably not going to happen. And I think you just, batted cleanup and brought home the bases or cleared the bases by saying, and this is a really important time to have this discussion. So
it is. And I was hopeful. I don't wish kind of life-altering pain on anyone, but if economic pain in terms of getting out a bit over our skis on some technologies, the expectation that, and I wrote about this a little bit, somehow we can wholesale change out an entire nation's energy system in a period of a couple of short decades, just as unprecedented. The physics and the economics don't support that. But we got to tee off and recognize that there is a long horizon for all these, I like to think about them in the cliched, it's all the above energy additions. It's not a transition. Right. But as we keep having these skirmishes and these battles, it just creates, it introduces more inertia into the kind of evolutionary process of the energy system.
Quite frankly, if we had used now that I think about it, used all the money in the IRA of stuff that may or may not actually make a difference here in the United States and use that to, in effect, finance energy systems to the rest of the world, we might have gotten a much better bang for our buck.
I had a former colleague who I won't name, but he was advising on a long ago kind of energy docudrama, and it was Bravo or FX, and the reporter was asking him just kind of his take, because some of these things were going to be surprising, if not shocking, to the viewers. And his quip was, and I'll paraphrase it a little bit. He said, most voters are ignorant about a lot of things. They're really ignorant about where their energy comes from.
Yeah, no, that's right.
And I think ignorance, incompetence, lack of understanding of the energy system and markets is really to use it as kind of a politically weaponized soundbite and not informing or not being informed. I just think I don't know that we'll ever get past that, just because it's
right.
It's fun to be bombastic on TV and social media. And I think it's believed to be one of the tools of political campaign success. And maybe it requires the electorate to get more interested in the deeper aspects of how the energy system works.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I will say this. I wish our president actually the best. I hope he's in good health. I hope he's bouncing back from COVID, and he's just kind of pissed off and stewing about this as opposed to something worse happening. But anyway, enjoyed it this week, Mark. I kind of getting used to not having Colin and Kirk. I think we're higher value education.
I was actually really looking forward to Kirk's take on what happened at the Open.
Oh yeah, I don't even know. So we'll save that for when he gets back.
I will say that, Colin Montgomerie, the Scotsman who doesn't play in majors, or I don't think plays much golf anymore, was pretty critical of Tiger continuing to push it when clearly he needs to retire, meaning you shouldn't even be playing in the Open at Troon. Tiger fires back. Well, I get to make that decision. He doesn't, because he's a past champion.
Right.
He can play until he's 60 or 61, something like that. Anyway,
exemption. So that was funny. All right, guys. Appreciate you tuning in. We'll be back next week, and hopefully we'll have Colin and Kirk with us.